Somewhere in your kitchen right now, there is probably a jar of something brown, thick, and unremarkable sitting on a shelf. Nobody thinks twice about it. It gets spread on toast, packed into a kid's lunchbox, stirred into a sauce. It feels like the most ordinary food in the world. But less than 200 years ago, the plant that makes this jar possible was considered something you fed to pigs. Wealthy Americans and Europeans looked at it and saw nothing but livestock feed and street trash. And yet today, that same plant is grown on nearly 50 million tons a year, and 9 out of 10 American households have some version of it in their pantry. This is the story of how a small, wrinkled legume that grows underground went from being an afterthought to becoming one of the most consumed foods on Earth. This is the story of the peanut. Long before anyone in Europe had ever heard the word, the peanut was already thousands of years into its own history on the other side of the planet. The oldest evidence of it comes from a dry, dusty valley in northern Peru, where archaeologists have pulled remains out of the ground dating back roughly 8,500 years. But researchers are fairly confident the peanut was not actually born there. Peru is simply where the climate happened to preserve it. The real birthplace was likely somewhere far more humid, probably in the lowlands stretching across what is now southern Bolivia, Paraguay, and northern Argentina, a region where organic remains rot away and leave almost nothing behind for archaeologists to find centuries later. From that quiet corner of South America, the plant began an extraordinary journey. Ancient farmers carried it north and south, generation after generation, until it had spread across the continent and pushed all the way up into what is now Mexico. Along the way, it stopped being just a crop and became something closer to a cultural symbol. Potters in South America were shaping clay into the likeness of peanuts by around 1500 BC. And archaeologists have pulled peanut remains out of ancient tombs, tucked in alongside the dead, presumably to feed them on their journey into the afterlife. That is not how you treat livestock feed. That is how you treat something sacred. The Inca, in particular, held on to their love of the peanut for centuries, folding it permanently into their diet and their culture. But strangely, the story splits once it crosses into Mexico. The Aztecs, as far as we know, barely touched it. There is no clear written record of the peanut in Aztec society before European contact, which is a strange gap considering how far the plant had already traveled by that point. Not every civilization falls in love with the same food, even when it is sitting right in front of them. Then came the ships. The first Europeans to lay eyes on the peanut were the Spanish, and the earliest confirmed encounter comes from a Catholic missionary who ran into the plant on the island of Hispaniola in 1502. Writing about it decades later, he described a strange fruit that grew beneath the soil, with a shell that reminded him of a filbert nut, dried the way you might dry a pea or a chickpea. He was trying, in his own clumsy 16th century way, to describe something that had absolutely no equivalent back home. As Spanish and Portuguese sailors pushed further into Central and South America, they kept running into the same strange underground crop again and again. Here is where the plant earns its scientific name, and the name itself tells you almost everything you need to know about it. Botanists eventually classified it as Arachis hypogea, and that second word, hypogea, comes from Greek roots meaning under the earth. That is not poetic license, it is literal. Once a peanut flower gets pollinated above ground, something bizarre happens. A stalk-like structure shoots out from the flower and buries itself into the soil, and it is underground, out of sight, that the actual peanut develops. It is also worth clearing up a common mix-up here. In the kitchen, we call it a nut. Botanically, it is nothing of the sort. It is a legume, a close cousin of peas and beans, not almonds or cashews. The kitchen and the science lab have simply agreed to disagree on this one. Once the Spanish and Portuguese understood what they had found, the peanut began hitching rides across the globe. Nobody recorded exactly when it first touched European soil, but the earliest written mention comes from a doctor in Seville around 1574, who suggested eating the peanuts green, dried, or toasted. From Spain, it crept slowly through European gardens over the next century, more of a curiosity than a staple. But it was in Africa and Asia where the peanut really found a home. It reached India by the 1500s and China not long after, where it picked up a name that essentially translated to foreign bean. The Japanese, who received it from China, called it something similar, a Chinese bean, a small chain of borrowed names tracing the plant's path across an entire continent. But the most consequential leg of this journey had nothing to do with trade routes or curious botanists. It had to do with the transatlantic slave trade. Peanuts had already become a common food in Portuguese trading posts along the coast of Africa, and they were quickly adopted by local populations there. The crop spread so fast and so widely across the African continent that early European botanists actually assumed, incorrectly, that peanuts had originated in Africa all along. When enslaved Africans were forced onto ships bound for the Americas, peanuts often went with them, both as a food source during the brutal crossing and as a crop planted once they arrived. Some historians believe this, not South America directly, may be how peanuts first reached the shores of the future United States. Enslaved people carried their own words for the plant too. Depending on the region, terms that eventually became goober and pindar in English traced directly back to African languages, small linguistic fossils embedded in a food most people think of as purely American. And yet, despite spreading across 3 continents, the peanut spent a very long time being treated as something beneath notice. Even a figure like Thomas Jefferson experimented with growing peanuts on his land, but commercial farming never took off in any serious way in the early United States or in Europe. Part of the problem was climate. Peanuts thrive in warm conditions, and the northern regions of the US and Europe simply were not suited for large-scale cultivation. Part of the problem was labor. Before industrial machinery existed, harvesting peanuts was slow, dirty, back-breaking work. And part of the problem, frankly, was reputation. For much of this period, the peanut was seen as a food for the poor, and even more specifically, as food for pigs. It sat at the very bottom of the food hierarchy in the eyes of wealthy Americans and Europeans. That began to shift in the early 1800s, not through elite dining rooms, but through the streets. Peanuts were cheap, portable, and durable, which made them the perfect snack for a rapidly urbanizing world. Vendors started selling them outside theaters and circus tents, and the crowds that gathered in the cheapest, rowdiest seats to snack on them left such a mess of shells behind that those sections of the audience earned a nickname that has outlived the original context entirely: the Peanut Gallery. Then the Civil War accelerated everything. Soldiers on both sides, but especially in the South, often had no luxury of being picky about what they ate, particularly as food shortages worsened. Many discovered a genuine fondness for peanuts simply because they were available and filling. At the same time, wartime demand for oil spiked, and peanut oil helped fill that gap. By the time the war ended, the crop had firmly wedged itself into the American diet, still going by a tangle of regional names: goobers, pindars, groundnuts, earth nuts, ground beans. The word peanut itself had technically already been recorded decades earlier, back in 1794, but it would take until the 20th century for that name to finally beat out all its rivals. The real explosion, though, came at the turn of the century, and it came out of a crisis. Southern agriculture in the early 1900s was in serious trouble. Decades of relentless cotton farming had drained the soil of nutrients, and an insect called the boll weevil was tearing through what crops remained, devastating yields across the region. Agricultural scientists knew the solution involved rotating crops to give the soil a chance to recover, but farmers were reluctant to abandon cotton since it had always been so profitable. Into this crisis stepped a scientist named George Washington Carver, who threw his research behind alternative crops that could restore southern soil. And among the many plants he championed, none is more tightly linked to his legacy than the peanut. Carver did not invent the peanut, and he did not invent peanut butter either, but he became its most tireless advocate, developing and promoting hundreds of potential uses for the crop, from new recipes to shaving cream to shoe polish. Most of those inventions never went anywhere commercially, but his broader mission worked. He convinced farmers to diversify, and the peanut became a genuine cash crop across the American South almost overnight. World War I pushed production even further, and the crop's cheapness and versatility carried it straight through the Great Depression and into World War II, becoming, along the way, one of the most reliable staples in the American pantry. Curiously, peanut butter never achieved the same cultural grip in Europe that it did in the United States, a divide that still exists on supermarket shelves today. Which brings us to the question everyone actually wants answered. Who invented peanut butter? The honest answer is messier than most people expect. If you want to be technical about it, the Inca were grinding peanuts into a paste centuries earlier, which makes them, arguably, the first people on Earth to create something resembling peanut butter, even if it looked nothing like the smooth spread in a modern jar. The Aztecs are frequently given credit as well, since that appears to be a historical mix-up, since peanuts were barely used in Aztec society before Europeans arrived. What we do know is that Dutch colonists in South America were producing something called peanut cheese by the late 1700s, a much firmer, denser cousin of peanut butter. There are also hints of a Cuban peanut paste making its way to New York sometime in the early 1800s, though the trail there is thin. The first clearly documented modern peanut butter, the kind that actually resembles what you would recognize today, came out of Montreal, where a man patented his process in the 1880s. About a decade later, an American businessman in St. Louis began producing and selling his own version. Around the same time, a doctor known for his work in health and nutrition began promoting a nut butter made partly from peanuts as a high-protein alternative to meat, particularly for patients who struggled to chew solid food. By the close of the 19th century, people were spreading it onto bread, and it did not take long for someone to have the idea of pairing it with jelly. The first documented peanut butter and jelly sandwich shows up on record right around 1901. Peanut butter was not cheap at first. It started out as something closer to a specialty item, but as production techniques improved and as new methods extended its shelf life, it slowly transformed into an everyday staple. During both world wars, with meat rationed and household budgets stretched thin, peanut butter became a dependable way to keep protein on the table, both for families at home and for soldiers overseas. And that is more or less the story that carried the peanut into the world we live in now. A plant that began underground in a humid corner of South America, carried across oceans by missionaries, traders, and enslaved people who had no idea what it would eventually become. Dismissed for centuries as fit only for livestock and the poor, and then, almost by accident, turned into one of the most quietly essential crops on the planet. Today, the world grows close to 50 million tons of peanuts every year, led by China, India, and Nigeria, 3 countries scattered across 3 different continents, each with its own centuries-old relationship to this small, unglamorous legume. It is easy to look at a jar of peanut butter and see nothing but breakfast, but underneath that ordinary jar is a 9,000-year journey through ancient tombs, colonial ships, slave trade routes, war rationing, and a scientist trying to save southern farmland one recipe at a time. The peanut did not arrive at your table by accident. It survived centuries of being ignored to get there. If this video taught you something you did not expect to learn about a food you eat every week, hit subscribe and let me know in the comments which part of the peanut story surprised you the most.